For years, the royal family believed the final chapter of Princess Diana's legacy had already been written. Her will had been sealed, studied, and quietly executed. But one morning, inside a quiet legal office tied to the crown, a discovery changed everything. A forgotten amendment buried in legal archives suddenly resurfaced. What it contained stunned even the most seasoned royal lawyers. And when its implications reached King Charles, insiders say the monarch was left completely devastated. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The discovery did not happen during a dramatic investigation or a scandalous probe. It began quietly, almost mundanely, during what should have been a routine archival audit carried out by royal legal staff responsible for maintaining the crown's historic estate records. For decades, the documents tied to Princess Diana's estate had remained sealed and carefully catalogued, stored among thousands of legal papers that documented the monarchy's complicated financial and personal history. These audits happened from time to time, largely procedural, rarely revealing anything unexpected. But on this particular morning, one junior legal researcher noticed something unusual while reviewing the official file associated with Diana's will. Tucked within a secondary folder, one that appeared to have been logged years after the original document, was a sealed attachment that had never been referenced in the primary registry of her estate. At first, the lawyers assumed it was a clerical error. Royal documentation spans generations, and minor filing mistakes occasionally surface. Yet as the envelope was carefully opened and the document inside examined, confusion began to ripple through the office. The text they were reading was not a routine annotation or legal clarification. It was a formal amendment signed months after Diana's main will had already been finalized. The signatures were valid. The legal formatting was precise. The witnesses listed were legitimate. Somehow, this amendment had been drafted, authorized, and quietly filed, but it had never been integrated into the primary documentation governing Diana's estate. The more the lawyers studied it, the more unsettling the discovery became. What immediately caught their attention was the subject matter addressed in the amendment. The wording focused specifically on access to Diana's personal inheritance and the protection of her legacy assets funds, heirlooms, and private holdings she had intended to safeguard for the future. This alone was not unusual. Many members of the royal family establish strict guidelines regarding how their estates should be managed across generations. But the language Diana used in this amendment carried a level of precision that suggested careful foresight. She was not merely allocating wealth, she was building a legal framework designed to control who could influence that inheritance long after her death. Then the lawyers reached the portion of the amendment that introduced an entirely new concept, one that had never appeared in the original will. Diana had written a clause addressing the role of future spouses entering the royal family through her sons. The phrasing was unmistakably deliberate. At the time the amendment was written, neither Prince William nor Prince Harry had married, and the identities of their future partners were completely unknown. Yet Diana had clearly considered the possibility that individuals from outside the royal circle might one day become connected to her estate through marriage. And she had decided to draw a firm legal boundary around that possibility. The legal team quickly realized the implications. Decades had passed since the amendment was signed. During that time, the royal family had evolved, marriages had taken place, and new figures had entered the monarchy's complex structure. One of those figures was Meghan Markle. Her arrival into the royal family through her marriage to Prince Harry had already transformed public perceptions of the monarchy, introducing a modern dynamic that had both energized and unsettled royal tradition. Now, the lawyers were staring at a clause written long before Meghan had ever met Harry, yet the language appeared to apply directly to someone in her position. Within minutes, what had begun as quiet curiosity turned into urgent concern. The amendment's wording raised questions about who could access certain aspects of Diana's inheritance, who could influence decisions tied to her legacy, and how those restrictions might affect members of the royal family today. No one in the office was prepared to make immediate conclusions, but one thing became clear: this document could not remain hidden within the archives any longer. Senior palace advisors were notified almost immediately. Calls were placed to Buckingham Palace, where officials responsible for overseeing royal legal matters began reviewing the amendment's contents with growing unease. The discovery forced them to revisit estate procedures that had been assumed settled decades earlier. Diana's will had always been regarded as carefully structured and thoroughly executed. But this amendment suggested that a crucial piece of her intentions had remained overlooked for years. The urgency of the situation quickly reached the highest level of the monarchy. Within hours, the document and its preliminary legal interpretations were presented to King Charles III. According to insiders familiar with the moment, the monarch listened in stunned silence as the lawyers explained what they had uncovered. Diana's voice, preserved in legal language from the past, was suddenly shaping conversations inside the palace once again. And the implications of her words were not theoretical. They carried real consequences for members of the royal family living today. Those present in the briefing later described the atmosphere as heavy with disbelief. Charles had spent decades navigating the complicated legacy left by his marriage to Diana. Public memory, emotional history, and royal duty had all intertwined in ways that often placed him at the center of difficult narratives. Yet this revelation was different. This was not media speculation or public debate. It was a legal document written by Diana herself, resurfacing years after her death, with the power to reshape conversations about inheritance, loyalty, and control within the royal family. And as the implications settled in, the reality became impossible to ignore. What Diana had written all those years ago was no ordinary adjustment to her estate. It was a deliberate safeguard, one that seemed to anticipate conflicts the royal family had only begun to experience decades later. But as lawyers began examining the amendment line by line, it became clear that the true shock was not the document itself, it was the precise wording Diana had chosen. Words that would soon ignite a legal and emotional storm within the royal family. Princess Diana had always been careful when it came to protecting her sons. Even during the darkest years of her separation from Prince Charles, she quietly worked behind the scenes to ensure that William and Harry's futures remained secure. What few people knew, however, was that Diana may have also anticipated conflicts that hadn't yet happened and left behind a legal safeguard designed to control exactly who could access her legacy. Long before the amendment resurfaced in those royal legal archives, Diana had already built a reputation for thinking several steps ahead when it came to her children. The world often saw her as the emotional heart of the monarchy, a compassionate figure who spoke openly about pain, loneliness, and resilience. Yet behind that public image existed another side of Diana that very few people fully understood. She was cautious, strategic, intensely protective of Prince William and Prince Harry in ways that extended far beyond motherhood. During the painful years of her separation from Charles, when the royal marriage was unraveling under global scrutiny, Diana began quietly reviewing the legal structures surrounding her personal estate. She was determined that whatever happened to her, the future of her sons would remain shielded from uncertainty manipulation, or influence she could not control. The amendment discovered by palace lawyers revealed just how carefully she had planned. Buried within its legal language was a protective clause, one that connected inheritance rights directly to the marriages of her sons. It was not written with hostility or suspicion, but with deliberate caution. Diana appeared to understand that the royal family's future would inevitably involve new people entering its inner circle through marriage. Those marriages would shape alliances, influence decisions, and alter the delicate balance of the monarchy itself. But according to the wording of this clause, Diana wanted to ensure that her personal assets, everything she had fought to preserve for her children, remained anchored firmly within her direct bloodline. The language was unmistakably clear in its intention. Diana's estate, particularly the portions connected to personal trusts, private funds, and treasured collections of jewelry, was designed to flow directly through her children and eventually to her grandchildren. These were not simply financial arrangements. They represented a legacy that Diana believed belonged to the family she had brought into the world. Royal historians who later examined the amendment began speculating about her mindset during the period it was drafted. Diana had lived through intense scrutiny from palace insiders and outside influences alike. She had seen how marriages within the monarchy could reshape power structures overnight. It was possible, perhaps even likely, that she feared future partners entering the royal family might eventually gain influence over assets she had intended solely for her sons and their descendants. That fear, if it existed, had been quietly translated into legal precision. The clause effectively restricted any outside party from exercising authority over Diana's legacy assets. The wording did not accuse anyone, and it did not name specific individuals. Instead, it established a boundary, one that ensured only Diana's direct heirs could control how those assets were managed, distributed, or preserved. For decades, the clause remained hidden because the amendment itself had been filed separately from the main will documentation. Its existence faded into bureaucratic obscurity, tucked away in archives where few people had reason to look closely. But time changes the meaning of old decisions. When Diana wrote that clause, she could not have known the names or identities of the people who would one day marry her sons. She did not know that Prince William would eventually marry Catherine, or that Prince Harry would fall in love with Meghan Markle. Yet as palace lawyers studied the amendment now decades after Diana's death, the language suddenly felt startlingly relevant. Meghan's arrival into the royal family had already transformed royal dynamics in ways no one had predicted. Her presence brought global attention, cultural change, and, at times, profound tension within the institution. The amendment did not mention Meghan, but its implications now seemed impossible to ignore. If Diana's clause was interpreted exactly as written, it meant that any spouse entering the royal family through her sons would be unable to exercise influence over the portions of her estate protected by that legal safeguard. In practical terms, that restriction could affect control over certain funds, heirlooms, and personal assets that had long been associated with Diana's memory. The lawyers reviewing the document began to realize that what they were holding was more than a forgotten legal note from the past. It was a framework that could reshape how Diana's legacy was handled within the modern royal family. Inside palace circles, concern grew quickly. Advisors understood that legal language written decades earlier now had the potential to create deeply complicated questions. Not just legal questions, but emotional ones, questions about loyalty, about intention, and about how the past continues to shape the present. Diana's words had survived long after she was gone, and now they were resurfacing at a moment when the royal family was already navigating fragile relationships and shifting public narratives. The more closely the amendment was examined, the clearer it became that Diana's foresight might extend far beyond simple inheritance planning. The clause hinted at a deeper awareness, an almost unsettling anticipation that the monarchy's future could bring tensions no one yet understood. And as palace lawyers continued dissecting every line of the document, a quiet unease began to spread through the royal legal offices. And as legal experts continued reading the amendment, one line written in precise legal language began to raise a troubling question. Had Diana deliberately designed this clause for a future conflict no one yet understood? It was only when lawyers reached the third paragraph of the amendment that the true magnitude of Diana's decision became clear. The wording was careful, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. A single clause quietly redefined who could and who could never access certain parts of Diana's estate. In legal terms, it seemed simple. But within the delicate balance of royal family relationships, it had the potential to ignite one of the most explosive inheritance controversies in decades. At first, the lawyers studying the amendment assumed they were dealing with a technical clarification, something procedural meant to tidy the language of Diana's original will. That assumption vanished the moment they focused on the clause that appeared midway through the document. The sentence structure was precise, unmistakably deliberate, and written with the calm authority of someone who had thought deeply about the future. Diana had not simply adjusted a legal detail. She had inserted a protective mechanism designed to determine exactly who would benefit from certain parts of her legacy. The phrase that caught everyone's attention was what legal experts later described as a direct lineage restriction clause. Those 4 words changed the entire interpretation of the amendment. In simple terms, the clause established a boundary around specific trusts and personal assets connected to Diana's estate. According to the wording, only Diana's biological descendants would be permitted to benefit from those holdings. That meant the inheritance would move through a very narrow line, first to her sons and then eventually to their children. The language left no room for ambiguity. The beneficiaries were defined by bloodline alone. What made the clause so striking was what it excluded. Spouses, regardless of title, marriage status, or royal rank, were specifically prevented from exercising authority over those protected assets. They could not control them, they could not redirect them, and they could not influence decisions tied to their management. As the lawyers continued reading, the implications began to unfold like a slow and unsettling realization. The clause had been written years before the identities of William and Harry's future partners were known. Diana had not named any individual, nor had she singled out any hypothetical situation. Yet the structure of the clause suggested she had anticipated a future where outside influences might attempt to gain control over the financial and symbolic elements of her legacy. By restricting authority strictly to her descendants, Diana had effectively sealed her estate within the boundaries of her bloodline. That was when one name inevitably entered the conversation. Meghan Markle. Her marriage to Prince Harry had already introduced a new chapter in the royal story, one filled with global attention, controversy, admiration, and criticism. The lawyers understood that Diana's amendment was not written with Meghan in mind. How could it have been? But the legal framework Diana created decades earlier suddenly intersected with Meghan's position inside the monarchy. If the clause was enforced exactly as written, it meant that Meghan could not exercise influence over the trusts and assets protected under Diana's amendment. Even if those assets flowed through Harry, the authority surrounding them would remain strictly tied to Diana's direct lineage. For the legal advisors examining the document, The situation was both fascinating and deeply concerning. Some interpreted the clause as Diana's attempt to prevent precisely the kind of inheritance disputes that often erupt within powerful families. By locking her estate within her bloodline, she had removed the possibility that spouses could challenge or reshape her intentions after her death. It was a safeguard, quiet, methodical, and remarkably forward-thinking. Yet that same safeguard now carried the potential to create tension in a modern royal family already navigating fragile relationships. The deeper the lawyers studied the amendment, the more complicated the situation appeared. If the clause became publicly known, it would immediately raise questions about access, authority, and control over one of the most emotionally charged legacies in modern royal history. Diana was not simply a former princess whose estate could be discussed in legal terms. She remained one of the most beloved and symbolic figures the monarchy had ever known. Anything connected to her legacy carried immense emotional weight for the public and even more for the family she had left behind. Inside palace circles, the fear began to grow that the amendment could trigger a storm unlike anything the royal household had faced in years. If the public learned that Diana had created a clause excluding spouses from control over her estate, speculation would explode. Commentators would debate what Diana had meant, why she had written it, and whether the clause was a reflection of foresight, caution, or something more personal. And inevitably, attention would turn toward Meghan's position within that legal structure. Royal insiders understood the stakes immediately. This was not simply a matter of paperwork. It touched the legacy of Diana, the future of Harry's family, and the fragile equilibrium of a monarchy already under intense scrutiny. What had started as a quiet discovery inside a legal archive now threatened to ripple outward into public controversy. And yet, even as the legal meaning of the clause became clear, another reality loomed just beyond the documents themselves. Because the implications of Diana's words were not confined to lawyers and advisors. They would soon reach the inner circle of the royal family, the people whose lives were most deeply tied to her memory. But while the legal implications were serious, the emotional impact inside the royal family, particularly for King Charles, was about to become far more personal. When the palace legal team finally briefed King Charles on the discovery, insiders say the room fell silent. The monarch had lived through decades of public scrutiny surrounding Diana's legacy. But this was something different. This was not a media rumor or family dispute. It was Diana herself speaking from the past through a legally binding document. And what she had written would force Charles to confront a reality he never expected. The briefing took place quietly, away from the noise that usually surrounds royal affairs. By the time the document reached King Charles, it had already been examined repeatedly by palace legal advisors, each of them arriving at the same uneasy conclusion: the amendment was genuine and its implications could not be ignored. When the lawyers began explaining what they had uncovered, Charles listened without interruption. Those present later described the moment as tense, almost surreal. For years, the story of Diana's will had been considered settled history, an emotional chapter that had already been closed. Yet now, through a forgotten amendment, Diana's voice seemed to return unexpectedly, reshaping conversations within the monarchy once again. The lawyers carefully laid out the facts. The amendment was authentic. The signatures had been verified. The legal structure followed every requirement necessary for a valid modification to a will. Charles reportedly asked the same question more than once, his voice measured but heavy with disbelief. Was there any possibility the document had been misfiled or misinterpreted? Could it somehow be incomplete or invalid? Each time, the answer remained the same. The amendment met every legal standard. It carried the authority of Diana's intentions exactly as she had written them. There was no simple way to dismiss it. For a moment, the room shifted from legal discussion to something far more personal. Diana was not merely a historical figure to Charles. She was a central chapter of his life, one that had unfolded under relentless public scrutiny and left lasting emotional consequences for the royal family. Hearing her words echoed through legal language decades after her death forced Charles to revisit memories he had long tried to place behind him. The past, it seemed, was not finished speaking. Those close to the monarch say his reaction was not anger, but quiet reflection. Charles understood the symbolic weight Diana still carried, both within the royal family and in the eyes of the public. Her legacy had shaped the lives of their sons and influenced how the monarchy itself was perceived by the world. Now, through this amendment, Diana had introduced a clause that could ripple through the present in ways no one had anticipated. Charles began considering not only the legal meaning of the document, but the emotional consequences it might trigger. One concern rose above the rest: Prince Harry. The clause surrounding Diana's estate did not merely exist as an abstract legal safeguard. Its interpretation could directly affect Harry's household and his family's relationship to Diana's legacy. Charles reportedly asked the advisors how the amendment might influence Harry's authority over the trusts connected to his mother. The answers were cautious. Technically, the assets still flowed through Diana's sons, but the restriction placed around spouses created a sensitive dynamic, one that could place Harry in an uncomfortable position between honoring his mother's wishes and protecting the family he had built with Meghan. Palace advisors did not hide their concerns. If the amendment became widely known, it could intensify tensions that were already fragile. The royal family had spent years navigating public narratives surrounding Harry and Meghan, and the monarchy's stability often depended on careful management of perception. A legal clause that appeared to exclude a royal spouse from access to Diana's legacy would almost certainly ignite speculation. Critics might frame it as foresight. Supporters might interpret it as protection. But the debate itself could place the royal family in the center of yet another storm. Charles understood this risk immediately. The monarchy was not simply a private family, it was an institution built on public trust and symbolic continuity. Every decision, every revelation had the potential to influence how the crown was viewed across the world. The amendment introduced a new layer of complexity that could reopen old wounds and stir new controversies. As the meeting progressed, the weight of that possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore. By the time the discussion ended, insiders say Charles appeared visibly shaken. Not because the legal language was complicated, but because of what it represented. Diana's intentions, written decades earlier, were suddenly shaping the present once again. The monarch had spent years attempting to guide the royal family forward, focusing on stability and continuity. Now, unexpectedly, the past had returned with a voice powerful enough to alter that path. Yet even as Charles struggled to process the revelation, palace advisors realized the most difficult question still remained unanswered: how would Prince Harry react once he learned what Diana's amendment truly meant? For Prince Harry, his mother's memory has always been deeply personal. Diana's influence shaped his worldview, his choices, and even his decision to step away from royal life. But now, decades after her passing, a new layer of her legacy had emerged, and it placed him in an impossible position. Because the amendment to her will did not just protect Diana's estate. It forced Harry to confront a painful divide between his family's past and his present. Inside palace circles, the question of whether Harry should be told immediately became a quiet but urgent debate. Legal advisors understood the sensitivity of the situation. Diana's amendment was not simply another royal document tucked away in an archive. It was her voice, her intentions resurfacing at a moment when the relationship between Harry and the rest of the royal family was already strained. Some advisors argued that withholding the information could create even greater problems later. Others believed that revealing the amendment too quickly might ignite emotional reactions before the legal implications were fully understood. Every option carried risk, and the palace knew that once Harry learned the truth, there would be no way to contain the ripple effects. The amendment placed Harry in a complicated position almost immediately. According to the clause lawyers had uncovered, certain parts of Diana's estate remained tightly bound to her direct bloodline. Those trusts, funds, and personal assets could pass through Harry as one of her sons, but the authority surrounding them would remain strictly limited. The wording made it clear that spouses would have no influence over how those holdings were managed. For Harry, this created a deeply personal conflict. On one side stood his mother's intentions, preserved in legal language that seemed designed to protect her legacy. On the other stood the life he had built with Meghan, a partnership that had already challenged many traditional expectations within the monarchy. The emotional tension surrounding this discovery was impossible to ignore. Diana had always been more than a distant memory to Harry. Her loss shaped his understanding of loyalty, vulnerability, and resilience. He had spoken openly over the years about the profound role she played in guiding his decisions. The idea that she had left behind instructions that might affect Meghan's position within the royal structure would inevitably stir complicated feelings. Honoring his mother's wishes had always been deeply important to him. Yet protecting the family he now shared with Meghan carried equal weight. The amendment seemed to pull those two loyalties in opposite directions. Palace insiders feared that the discovery could reopen wounds the royal family had spent years trying to heal. Harry's departure from active royal duties had already reshaped the monarchy's internal dynamics. Conversations surrounding trust, loyalty, and responsibility had grown more delicate than ever. Introducing a legal clause that appeared to limit Meghan's influence over Diana's legacy risked reigniting tensions that were never fully resolved. Advisors worried not only about Harry's personal reaction, but also about how the wider public might interpret the situation if it became widely known. Beyond the immediate family drama, the amendment raised a deeper question about the control of Diana's historical legacy. Her memory had become one of the most powerful emotional forces connected to the monarchy. For millions around the world, Diana symbolized compassion, courage, and independence. The assets tied to her estate were not simply financial resources, they were part of a broader narrative about who Diana was and what she represented. Whoever held authority over those assets also carried influence over how that legacy would be preserved in the future. For Harry, the choice looming ahead was painfully complex. Legally, he could attempt to challenge aspects of the amendment or explore ways to reinterpret its limitations. Yet doing so would risk appearing as though he were contesting his mother's explicit intentions. Respecting the clause, on the other hand, could create uncomfortable dynamics within his own household. Either path carried consequences not only for Harry personally, but for the fragile balance of relationships connecting the royal family across continents. As the palace quietly prepared for the moment when Harry would learn the full details of Diana's amendment, the pressure surrounding the situation continued to build. Every advisor understood that the discovery had already crossed a point of no return. The legal language written decades earlier was now influencing decisions in the present, and its impact was spreading beyond the walls of the palace. But as Harry wrestled with the emotional weight of his mother's words, royal advisors began to realize that the legal implications of Diana's amendment were only just beginning to unfold. The moment the emotional shock of Diana's amendment began to settle, a new and equally troubling reality started to emerge inside palace legal offices. What had initially appeared to be a surprising discovery was rapidly transforming into a complex legal puzzle, one that could potentially reshape the management of Diana's estate and reopen questions that many believed had been resolved decades earlier. Advisors now understood that this was no longer simply a matter of family sensitivity. It was a matter of law, precedent, and the fragile political balance surrounding the monarchy itself. Within hours of Prince Harry's situation becoming the focus of discussion, teams of legal experts began quietly reviewing every detail of Diana's estate framework. The amendment had created a legal boundary that was unusually precise, and its implications stretched further than anyone had initially anticipated. If the clause restricting access to Diana's legacy assets was interpreted strictly, it meant the control of those resources would remain tightly locked within her bloodline, shielded from outside influence, regardless of marital status or royal titles. On paper, the wording seemed straightforward. In practice, however, it introduced a series of questions that palace lawyers could not ignore. Some advisors began exploring the possibility of a legal challenge, though the idea itself was controversial. Could the clause be contested if it created complications within the modern royal structure? Could an argument be made that the amendment no longer reflected the evolving realities of the monarchy? The answers were far from simple. Diana's amendment had been signed properly, witnessed legally, and preserved in a format recognized by estate law. That meant the document carried enormous authority. Attempting to alter or reinterpret its meaning could open a legal battle that the palace had no desire to fight publicly. At the same time, ignoring the amendment was not an option either. The moment the document resurfaced, it became part of the official legal record governing Diana's estate. Advisors realized that if the clause was not addressed carefully, it could eventually become a point of dispute, either within the family itself or through external scrutiny. In royal matters, perception often carries as much weight as legality. A misunderstanding about Diana's intentions could quickly spiral into a media storm, especially if it appeared that the palace was attempting to conceal or manipulate her wishes. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense as meetings stretched late into the evening. Lawyers, advisors, and senior officials debated every possible interpretation of the amendment. Some believed the clause would ultimately protect the monarchy by preventing outside interference in Diana's legacy. Others worried it could deepen existing fractures within the royal family, particularly if it appeared to single out certain individuals indirectly. Each conversation circled the same uneasy truth: Diana's foresight had created a legal safeguard powerful enough to influence the monarchy decades after her death. The deeper the legal team examined the amendment, the more they recognized the delicate position it placed the palace in. If the document became public knowledge, speculation would explode. Commentators would argue about what Diana had truly intended. Critics might claim the clause reflected mistrust toward future spouses entering the royal family. Supporters might argue it was simply a mother's attempt to protect her children's inheritance. The narrative could spin in countless directions, and each version carried the potential to intensify tensions already simmering beneath the surface of royal life. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, internal debates continued to grow more intense. Should the monarchy publicly acknowledge the amendment before rumors began to spread? Or would raising the issue only amplify a controversy that might otherwise remain contained within legal circles? Every strategy carried risks, and none offered a clear path forward. The palace had spent years trying to maintain stability during a period of immense change for the royal family. Now, a single forgotten document threatened to introduce a new wave of uncertainty. Amid these discussions, one uncomfortable realization slowly took shape among the advisors. Diana's amendment was not merely a legal safeguard, it was a message preserved in time. Whether she intended it as protection, precaution, or foresight, the clause had been designed to endure beyond her lifetime. And now that it had resurfaced, it could not simply be dismissed as a historical footnote. As the palace struggled to determine its next move, the tension surrounding the amendment continued to build quietly behind the scenes. The monarchy had faced countless crises before, but this situation carried a uniquely emotional weight because it revolved around one of the most beloved figures in modern royal history. Diana's legacy had always possessed extraordinary power, and now that power was beginning to influence decisions at the very highest level of the crown. And as the legal debates deepened and the palace searched for a path through the uncertainty, one truth became impossible to ignore: the consequences of Diana's amendment were only beginning to reveal themselves, and the storm surrounding her legacy had not yet reached its peak. As the legal debates intensified behind palace doors, another reality began to surface, one that had little to do with paperwork and everything to do with perception. Royal history has always shown that what happens within the family rarely stays hidden forever. Sooner or later, whispers escape the walls of the palace, and when they do, they begin shaping a narrative the monarchy can no longer control. With Diana's amendment now circulating among advisors, the emotional fallout was already beginning to ripple through the royal ecosystem, quietly building the kind of tension that could soon spill into the public arena. Inside the palace, the conversation slowly shifted from legal interpretation to something far more delicate: the human consequences. Diana was not simply a former royal whose estate could be discussed in detached legal language. She remained one of the most beloved figures the monarchy had ever produced, and anything tied to her legacy carried immense emotional weight for the public. Advisors understood that the moment the story reached the outside world, attention would immediately turn to one central question: who stood to gain from Diana's wishes, and who did not? And in that unfolding narrative, Meghan's name would almost certainly move to the center of the storm. For Meghan, the situation was uniquely complicated. Her entry into the royal family had already sparked fierce global debate, transforming her into one of the most talked about figures connected to the monarchy in decades. Supporters viewed her as a symbol of modernization and change, while critics accused her of disrupting long-standing traditions. Now, with the existence of Diana's amendment quietly emerging within palace discussions, the possibility that she could be excluded from influence over Diana's legacy added another layer to an already volatile story. Even if the clause had never been written with Meghan specifically in mind, public interpretation would inevitably link the two. Royal advisors feared that this perception alone could ignite a powerful narrative outside palace control. The media, always eager to dissect royal conflict, would likely frame the amendment as a sign of foresight from Diana, an attempt to protect her legacy from outside interference. Others might argue the opposite, claiming the clause was being used to marginalize someone who had already faced enormous scrutiny since joining the royal family. In either scenario, the monarchy risked becoming the stage for yet another deeply personal controversy. Within the royal household, tensions quietly intensified as the implications became clearer. Family dynamics had already shifted dramatically in recent years, with relationships strained by distance, disagreements, and competing visions for the monarchy's future. The amendment now hovered over those fragile connections like an unresolved question. Some insiders believed it reinforced the idea that Diana had always prioritized the independence of her sons above all else. Others worried it might deepen the divide between Harry's household and the rest of the royal structure, particularly if the clause appeared to place limits on Meghan's role within Diana's legacy. Meanwhile, the emotional dimension of the situation continued to grow heavier. Diana's memory had long served as a powerful bond between William and Harry, a shared connection that transcended many of the tensions surrounding royal life. But now, her words preserved in legal language were being interpreted in ways that could influence the present. The idea that Diana had deliberately created safeguards around her legacy forced everyone involved to confront an uncomfortable truth. The past was not simply shaping the monarchy's history. It was actively shaping its future. Advisors began to recognize that the greatest challenge ahead might not be legal at all. It would be narrative control. Once a story connected to Diana reached the public sphere, it rarely remained quiet for long. Her legacy carried extraordinary emotional power, capable of stirring sympathy, outrage, admiration, and controversy all at once. If the amendment became widely known, it would invite endless speculation about Diana's intentions, her fears, and the family dynamics she may have anticipated long before they unfolded. And as palace officials quietly prepared for the possibility that the story could soon break beyond their control, one thing became increasingly clear. The discovery of Diana's amendment had already altered the emotional landscape of the monarchy. What began as a forgotten document hidden in legal archives was now influencing relationships, shaping perceptions, and stirring tensions that had been buried for years. Yet even as the public narrative began to take shape and the emotional stakes continued to rise, those closest to the situation understood that the most profound consequence of Diana's amendment had yet to reveal itself, and the final chapter of her legacy was still unfolding. What began as a quiet legal discovery inside a forgotten archive had now grown into something far larger than anyone inside the palace had anticipated. The amendment written by Princess Diana decades earlier was no longer just a document. It had become a force reshaping conversations about power, loyalty, and legacy within the monarchy itself. For years, the royal family believed Diana's influence belonged to the past, preserved in memory and public admiration. But the resurfacing of her amendment proved something remarkable. Even in absence, Diana still possessed the ability to alter the future of the crown. Within the palace, the weight of that realization settled heavily over every discussion that followed. Advisors could debate the legal wording, interpret its implications, and examine its boundaries from every possible angle. Yet beneath those technical conversations existed a deeper truth that no one could escape. Diana had left behind more than instructions about wealth or inheritance. She had left a message about protection, about control, and about the preservation of something she believed must remain within her own bloodline. That message now stood quietly in opposition to the complicated modern reality of the royal family. For King Charles, the discovery forced a difficult reckoning with the enduring power of Diana's legacy. The monarchy had moved forward in many ways since the turbulent years of their marriage. Generations had grown, roles had shifted, and the institution itself had attempted to evolve with the times. Yet Diana's amendment reminded everyone inside the palace that the past cannot simply be closed like an old chapter. Some decisions echo across decades, waiting for the moment when their meaning becomes clear. And now that moment had arrived. Prince Harry, too, stood at the center of this emotional crossroads. The amendment tied his mother's legacy directly to the future of her descendants, creating a legal framework that protected her wishes while simultaneously placing him under immense personal pressure. Every step forward required him to weigh two powerful loyalties: his devotion to the memory of Diana and his commitment to the family he had built with Meghan. The tension between those loyalties was not easily resolved, and the amendment ensured that the question of how Diana's legacy would be managed could never again be treated as a simple matter. Meanwhile, inside the broader royal household, the discovery forced the monarchy to confront something it rarely acknowledges openly: the enduring influence of individuals who once challenged the institution itself. Diana had never been a conventional royal figure. She questioned traditions, spoke candidly about personal struggles, and reshaped how the public connected with the monarchy. In life, her voice often disrupted the carefully maintained balance of royal authority. Now, even in death, her words were once again stirring the foundations of that same system. Advisors understood that the consequences of the amendment might continue unfolding long after the initial shock faded. Legal interpretations could evolve, family relationships could shift, and public narratives could reshape the story entirely. What remained constant, however, was the extraordinary power of Diana's legacy. Few figures in modern history have managed to influence both the emotional heart of a nation and the private decisions of a royal dynasty long after they were gone. As the palace moved cautiously forward, one truth became impossible to ignore. Diana's final safeguard had not simply protected her estate, it had preserved her voice in a way that still carried authority decades later. The monarchy now faced the delicate task of navigating that legacy, without reopening the wounds of the past or deepening the fractures of the present. Whether the amendment would ultimately bring clarity or further tension remained uncertain. But perhaps the most striking part of the entire story was the reminder that history within the royal family is never truly finished. Decisions made in quiet moments can echo for generations, and the influence of those who once shaped the monarchy can reappear when least expected. Diana's amendment was proof of that enduring truth. Her presence, it seemed, had never truly left the royal narrative, it had simply been waiting for the right moment to be heard again. And as the royal family continued grappling with the meaning of her words, one question lingered quietly in the background, unresolved and powerful. Had Diana always known that her final decision would one day change everything? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.